morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to another HRO Today Educational Podcast. I'm Elliot Clark. I'm the CEO of HRO Today. We publish HRO Today Magazine, HRO Today APAC, and HRO Today EMEA. We're the producers of the HRO Today forums and conferences held around the world and managers of the HRO Today Association. When we were kids, we were all told to sing the song, "It's a Small World After All." But if you've done that flight from New York to Singapore, you know that isn't geographically accurate. The world isn't really that small. However, and we're going to talk about this in detail, recent evolutions in business operations in the wake of the global pandemic and advances in workplace collaboration suites are increasingly not necessarily changing the diameter of the planet, but making work placeless. And we've talked about this a lot in HR. We're going to talk about how it applies to recruiting. This idea that work from one region can be performed by employees in another region isn't new, but it's increasingly not only feasible, but strategically advantageous. Now, of course, for our HR audience to take advantage of this placeless or borderless workforce, you have to be really good at sourcing and recruiting globally. So what are the advantages of nearshore and offshore talent acquisition and hiring? There are a few global recruitment providers who both perform this kind of service and advise clients on how to do it. One such provider is KellyOCG Sevenstep, and we have one of their executives here to help us understand the options, obstacles, and opportunities for offshore and nearshore sourcing and recruiting in this, we'll say, increasingly small but still complex world. Allow me to introduce Daniel Cornett of KellyOCG Sevenstep. Now, Daniel Cornett is the Senior Director of RPO for APAC. You'll know that by his lovely Australian accent. He is the Director of RPO APAC for KellyOCG and Sevenstep. He is responsible for ensuring they provide cutting-edge workforce solutions tailored to the evolving needs of the marketplace. He's a veteran of some of the top providers in RPO, as well as a veteran of working as the head of talent acquisition for some large companies in his native Australia. KellyOCG Sevenstep is the combination of two powerhouse providers of RPO, MSP, and total workforce solutions. They are also one of the most highly rated providers on the HRD Baker's Dozen in multiple categories. Dan, welcome to the podcast. Is there anything you want to add about KellyOCG Sevenstep for our audience?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Elliot. As you mentioned, we're a leading RPO provider. Our business operates globally in over 70 countries. We have 12 global talent hubs, which include two major hubs in APAC, which is in Bangalore, India, and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. We make over 100,000 hires annually, an impressive 98% client retention, and a 95% employee retention.
Now, why would a company, and I hear companies talking about this all the time, and I know you guys advise clients, but why would a company want to pursue an offshore or nearshore strategy for talent acquisition? What are the drivers that are driving this kind of strategy? And how do they justify the effort and complexity of offshore or nearshore recruiting? So I know that's a big question, but what are the motivations, if you will?
Yeah, so I'll start with the obvious one. I think cost efficiency, especially in the challenging global economy. The lower labor cost on offshoring and nearshoring markets can significantly reduce the overall hiring and operational expenses. The next is really to tap into global talent pools with niche skills or expertise that may be expensive locally. It was interesting. I was in the market a while ago for a tech recruiter, and I was having multiple conversations with candidates in Australia. And what I realized that remuneration expectations that they sort of came back with was pretty much in line with what we were paying our talent acquisition leader. And then, when I sort of reflected on that in comparison, if you were to nearshore that, to Malaysia and India, essentially you could have built out a small team, with the budget of that one recruiter, which essentially be all focused on that IT tech. I think the next thing is like scalability and flexibility. Essentially, you want to scale your teams up and down based on projects that you might have on the go or business cycles. With RPO, it's even quicker. Obviously, we've got multiple clients that we work with, and we have hub managers that watch the volumes that we can sort of shift our resources where necessary, which will give businesses that immediate flexibility. This one more from a nearshoring perspective. Nearshoring locations often share cultural similarities and language proficiency. So I love our team in Malaysia. Like most of our resources in Malaysia that work in that hub speak multiple languages, which, obviously English, Malay, Indonesian, Mandarin, that's just to name a few. And that really helps us to operate within the ASEAN region to support multiple countries. You've also got time zone advantage. It's that follow the sun model, especially if we're partnering with like companies out of the US. As they're wrapping up the day, we've got countries like India, Malaysia, Philippines starting theirs. So there's that handover. But also, these countries are willing to work shift work where needed. It's probably a controversial one, but I actually think gone are the days where, low skill, non-complex tasks have been offshored. Our recruitment team and sourcing team are absolute specialists in the field, and the quality and the output is quite impressive and high. With that said, we're also seeing a lot of companies offshoring parts of their business. For example, finance, IT, help desk, customer service, engineering, and obviously recruitment. So what they call that is a global capability center, with India really leading the way. We're seeing a lot of growth within this space, and a lot of businesses are partnering with us to sort of build that talent locally. To give you an indication of how much growth there's been in this space, over 450 of the Forbes Global 2000 companies have set up global capability centers in India, with over 825 centers and obviously hundreds of thousands of professionals hired. In the city of Bangalore, they kind of lead the way with 285 companies out of that 450 that I just mentioned, setting up their hubs in Bangalore. 60% of the global capability centers are North American, so mostly US-based clients. There's over 125 European firms active in India, and we're starting to see a massive increase in the UAE and Saudi companies considering India as a source of choice to set up a capability center. So as you can see, there's a lot of happening in the APAC region.
As you said, the drivers seem to be cost. That has been true for a while. And then the access to the global talent pool is actually becoming increasingly, I think, a driver as well, from what I understand, because you just might not be able to find the programmer in the budget or the professional, whatever category you may be seeking. So if these drivers you referenced are there for an organization, is there some kind of a checklist or readiness assessment that the HR leaders, the heads of TA, the heads of HR need to address to be able to take advantage of the offshore or nearshore strategy? Are there readiness items they need to have completed? What do you advise them in that situation?
Yeah, of course. When we talk to clients about, offshoring, we've got a comprehensive checklist that we use, but I can give you some examples around organizational readiness. We ask questions like, have you clearly defined roles, skills, and deliverables required? Have the job descriptions, qualifications, criteria been reviewed and updated? We consider structural alignment and governance. Who will interact with the offshore talent to support delivery? What are the processes in place for onboarding, collaboration, and performance tracking? Are the tools and systems fit for purpose for offshore teams? And then we think about, do you have the right balance? Is there a balance needed where you have in-country TA resources supporting the offshore hiring? And have you defined the setup model for different regions? Example, centralized versus decentralized. Will your approach vary by country, and how will that be determined? So there's just a few questions. Another question I always ask is, if you're setting up a recruitment team in India, have you brushed up on your cricket knowledge? The Indians' national sport is cricket, and yes, it's a joke, kind of. A lot of my team are, very passionate about recruitment, but also very passionate about cricket in India.
Yeah, it's more like an obsession than a sport over there. So I totally agree with you.
100%.
So when you look at those strategy items that you talked about, you sort of anticipated my next question a bit, which is how an organization like KellyOCG and Sevenstep can help a company pursuing this nearshore offshore strategy. Now I know, without saying you're a bit biased here, but I'm going to ask you anyway, why is it advantageous for a TA operation to use an RPO provider to implement this strategy? Why does that make sense?
Look, I think if you're learning global hiring, by trying to do it in-house could be an expensive lesson. There's some things to consider and potential risks. Maybe when you sort of start up there, the inability to attract talent, poor management of the work being done. You could get surprises around cultural differences, and that could change timeline, pay, and delivery of work. Expand the budgets and time to fill targets are not sort of what you sort of expected. Low manager satisfaction, poor work results, unexpectedly a heavy burden of managing the strategy and process. I think a good provider knows the questions you're missing. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a client in Australia about, essentially outsourcing to RPO, and we were talking for a couple of months. And he came back to me and said, "Hey, Dan, we've got to change the plan. We're looking to outsource a large portion of our business to India." I was like, "Oh, great. That's fantastic. Have you done that before?" He's like, No, first time." So I just asked a few questions, or sort of shared some examples that, in India, typically, at recruiter level, they have a 3-month notice period. Did you know that? He said, "No." Did you know that, depending on the salary and location, there potentially is a 50% drop-off rate, even after you wait for 3 months for that resource? He's like, "No." I asked him, how do you plan keeping the pipeline going? He wasn't sure. So I think that made him a little bit nervous. And after sort of raising a few of them points, we're still in conversations. So it's probably likely that we're going to partner with them on that journey in setting up their recruitment team in India. But I think a good provider knows the answers to the questions. We know the market, we know the attrition rates, we know the pipeline, and we use data and insights to make sure that we're ahead of the curve. The local expertise is massive. I think if you don't have it, it can be difficult to navigate. If you're not right, really the offshore function could have limited success. I think a good provider also turns processes into one process. Sourcing, recruitment, pay, compliance, legislation, the list goes on. For us, it's really no mystery. We've done this before. No surprises, no drama. That's what a good provider can deliver. When it comes to this kind of work, it shouldn't be exciting or an adventure. We want to make it, that the implementation, the delivery, the execution is no different to any other client, and simple and seamless.
Have you had examples where clients have tried to do it themselves and then realized they're over their head and, brought in, KellyOCG plus Sevenstep or some other functionality to sort of get them back on track? Because, I've been involved in these back in the day. It is complicated. You're working for, XYZ company may be very different in country A versus country B. That specific market and product knowledge often is critical to being effective. So have you had situations where you've had sort of rescue an operation that started it and maybe didn't go so well?
Yeah, I feel like we've had many conversations over the last year where businesses are thinking they haven't been in the thick of it, so they haven't really been over there. But as they're sort of exploring, a lot of smart talent leads will reach out to RPO providers just to sort of pick their brains, and we're always happy to provide advice where possible. But similar to the last scenario that I gave you, heaps of conversations around, how do we set up? What do we do? What are the cultural differences? How does that work? We sort of picked up at a point where we're happy to support them. So like I said, no one's been in the thick of it, but we have supported clients through that transition in offshoring.
Well, it's been interesting. And for those of you in our audience, these are some things to think about from a checklist perspective, from the opportunities are that the product knowledge, the cost savings, etc. But the work can be placeless, but the process has to be pristine. And I think that's an important point. I want to thank Dan Cornett, who is the Senior Director for RPO APAC for KellyOCG plus Sevenstep. Dan, thank you. Great insights. We did it quickly, but I'll have to have you back to talk about this some more, because I think this is something that a lot of companies are starting to do again, as once again, particularly in the post-pandemic world, it's become a more borderless workforce. So thanks for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you, Elliot. Thanks for having me.
All right. And for those of you in our audience, thank you for your time and attention. And if you're thinking about that song, It's a Small World After All, really not. It's not that small. And it actually is that complex. So if you're looking at doing this, it is a great idea. It is an effective strategy, it's a cost-saving strategy, and it gives you access to talent pools that might not be readily available within the country you initially thought you were going to place these jobs, but you got to do it well. So with that, there are great organizations out there like KellyOCG plus Sevenstep that can help. This is Elliot Clark. Thank you for your time and attention, and we look forward to you joining our next HRO Today Educational Podcast.